He never once told her he'd read them. Not the field logs, not the annotated survey reports, not the 400-page dissertation on pre-collapse linguistic drift that nobody else on the station had opened past the abstract. He never mentioned it. He never asked a question that would have given it away. And then, 11 months after she filed the first one, in the middle of a supply briefing that had nothing to do with linguistics or dissertations or her at all, he used a phrase she had buried on page 43 of a file she assumed no one would ever read twice. She noticed he didn't know she noticed. That gap between what he thought he'd hidden and what she'd caught is where this starts. The station was called Halyard 9, a relay and archive post strung along the outer trade corridor, 311 souls, mostly logistics and translation staff processing intercepted comms traffic from the Quadrata trade routes. Dr. Myril Akanjovas ran the linguistics annex. She had been there 4 years. She filed reports because filing reports was the job, not because she expected anyone to read past the summary line. Her file naming convention was a running joke on the annex floor. She numbered drafts by mood, not date. So V Angry Final V3 sat in the archive next to V Fine actually V1, a habit nobody had the nerve to ask her to fix. The first file was called Semantic Drift in Isolate Trade Pigeons, a working taxonomy. It was 47 pages. Page 43 contained a single observation she'd almost cut in the final edit, a note about how isolated speakers, cut off from a home language for long enough, don't lose vocabulary so much as they hoard it, keeping words in careful, slightly wrong storage, like objects wrapped for a move that never happens. She wrote that line at 300 station time, tired, half convinced it was too poetic for a technical annex report. She left it in because she was too tired to argue with herself. Rafe Duclos was a systems archivist 2 decks down. His job was retrieval infrastructure, making sure 4 decades of intercepted trade comms stayed searchable, not making sure anyone searched them. Nobody expected the archivist to read the archive. That was, in fact, the entire point of automating it. He had a reputation for being reliable and almost entirely silent, the kind of colleague people described when pressed as fine, I guess, competent, punctual, and otherwise unremarkable to everyone who had never seen his access logs. She found out by accident, the way most true things get found. 11 months after the pigeon taxonomy went into the general archive, Halyard 9 held a routine supply briefing. Nothing to do with linguistics, nothing to do with her at all, just quarterly allocation numbers, and a logistics officer named Bat reading through a spreadsheet in a voice built for exactly that purpose. Rafe was there because retrieval infrastructure needed its own supply line. Myril was there because everyone was there. Attendance was mandatory and revenge was informal. Rafe made a comment offhand about a comms buffer they were about to decommission. Old hardware, redundant now, scheduled for cold storage. He said the outgoing engineers were treating it like something to be discarded, when in fact it was still holding 4 decades of raw trade traffic nobody had fully indexed. He said they were hoarding it in slightly wrong storage, like something packed for a move that's never going to happen. Myril stopped writing on her tablet. It was not an unusual phrase to construct independently. Except it wasn't independent. It was hers, word for word, from a document she had written at 3 in the morning, filed under an annex code, read, as far as she knew, by exactly one supervisor doing a compliance check. She did not say anything in the briefing. She wrote the phrase down on her tablet, underlined it twice, and spent the rest of the meeting doing the kind of math that has nothing to do with numbers. How long has he had that file open? Bat kept reading numbers. Someone 2 seats down asked a question about crate volumes. Myril answered on autopilot, the way you can hold 2 conversations when one of them is only happening inside your own skull. She started checking, quietly, the way you check a lock you already know is fine. The annex system logged access, not content, just timestamps, user IDs, duration. She was not supposed to run that query for personal reasons. She ran it anyway, because curiosity outranks policy at 200 when nobody is watching the audit trail. Rafe Duclos had opened the pigeon taxonomy 14 times over 11 months. Not skimmed, 14 full-duration reads, the kind the system only logs when a document stays open longer than a scroll-through would take. He had also opened, and fully read, 6 more of her annex reports, going back to her first month on the station, including 2 she considered too dry for anyone outside the annex to finish. She cross-referenced the timestamps against the station's duty roster out of habit, The same instinct that made her cross-reference dialect samples against migration records. Most of the reads clustered late after his shift, before the station's dimmed-hour lighting cycle. He was not reading her work during downtime because he was bored. He was reading it after a full workday, on his own time, which is a different category of attention entirely. He had never cited her, never referenced her in a meeting where it would have counted as a compliment, never sent her so much as a one-line note saying good read. He had simply taken what she built at 3 in the morning, alone, half convinced it wasn't worth finishing, and kept it, carefully, in slightly wrong storage of his own, for whenever it turned out to be useful. She sat with that a long time before she understood why it mattered more than praise would have. Praise is cheap because it costs nothing to give and nothing to verify. This cost him something. It meant that for 11 months, in a quiet, unannounced, entirely unrewarded way, he had been paying attention to her, specifically on purpose, with no expectation that she would ever find out. She thought briefly about all the ways a person could have made that attention visible cheaply. A compliment in a meeting, a forwarded link, a comment on a shared channel, and how he had chosen none of them. Cheap attention leaves a trail because it wants credit. His left no trail because it had never once been asking for anything back. That was the part she could not stop turning over. Not that he had read her work, but that he had read it the way she wrote it, at night alone for no audience, expecting no one to notice. She did not confront him. She did something she considered more dangerous. She tested him. She filed a new report, a small one on a minor pidgin dialect nobody would flag, and buried a single deliberate detail on the second-to-last page. A private one. A phrase only someone who had read her carefully across years would recognize as a callback. The same, wrapped for a move, image, inverted, applied this time to a person instead of a language. She filed it on a Thursday. She did not tell anyone it existed. She told herself, while filing it, that she was testing a hypothesis about reading patterns, and she almost believed that, the way scientists sometimes almost believe the framing they use to make an experiment feel less personal than it is. 19 days later, in the annex break room, over reheated coffee neither of them liked, Rafe said, without looking up from his cup, that he thought moving on wasn't really about arriving anywhere. He thought it was about the packing, the deciding item by item what you were still carrying and what you'd finally agree to leave behind. He said it like a stray thought. He did not know she'd planted the trigger for it 3 weeks earlier at 3 in the morning, half convinced, again, that no one would ever read that far. She put her coffee down because her hand had started to shake slightly, and she did not want him to see that before she was ready to explain why. She spent the next 2 days doing what she did best, which was pattern recognition. She went back through 5 years of his own infrastructure reports, the ones nobody read, the ones she had never once opened before that week, looking for the same kind of quiet borrowing in reverse. His reports were dry by design, built for auditors and future archivists, not for anyone reading at 300 out of restlessness. But buried in a 5-year-old changelog for a retrieval index he'd rebuilt from scratch, she found a comment field, the kind meant only for other engineers, that read, "Rebuilt to make sure nothing filed here gets lost by accident. Some of it matters more than the filer thinks." It was dated 6 months before he'd ever opened one of her files. He had not built that habit for her. He had already been a person who kept things carefully, long before she arrived on the station, and she had simply been the first thing he'd found worth keeping on purpose. She did not find any instance of him using her words back at her before the supply briefing, which meant that moment in the break room was not a habit repeating. It was a choice, made once he already knew or suspected that she was watching him back. Halyard 9's decommission notice arrived on a Tuesday. Command was consolidating 3 relay posts into one, effective end of quarter, 91 days. Staff would be reassigned across 4 different postings, none guaranteed to overlap. The annex would be dissolved. The archive itself, all 40 years of it, would migrate to a central repository where no single archivist would ever again have the freedom to read one dissertation 14 times because he happened to want to. Rafe found out an hour before Meyeril did, because retrieval infrastructure got the technical brief first. He did not tell her that hour, not because he was hiding it, because he needed the hour to decide something, and he did not yet know what. He spent that hour the way he spent most of his hours, at his terminal, except this time he was not indexing anyone else's archive. He was reading his own access history, start to finish, watching the shape of 11 months laid out in timestamps. Her name recurring at the same late hour, night after night, long after anyone would have called it professional interest. When he told her, in the annex with the door open because neither of them had thought to close it, he did not offer comfort. He offered a request transfer form, already filled out, his own name in the applicant field, listing her posting as his requested destination. 3 weeks before the reassignment window officially opened, before anyone else on the station had filled out theirs. She asked him flatly why. He said he'd read that a person's real archive isn't the one with their name on it. It's the one someone else kept on purpose without being asked to. He said he'd been keeping hers for 11 months and didn't see a reason to stop just because the station was closing. It was not a speech. He said it the way he'd say a technical status report, looking mostly at the form and not at her, and that, more than the words themselves, is what convinced her he meant it. She did not answer him that day. She spent the evening in the annex alone, running one more query she wasn't authorized to run, not on him, this time, but on herself. Every file she'd ever filed, every 3 in the morning line she'd almost cut, laid out in chronological order. She read her own archive the way he must have. Not for the summary, for the person underneath it, half convinced the whole time that no one would ever bother. Somewhere around the 8th file she found a line she had forgotten writing. A footnote, technically off topic, about how the trade route's oldest pigeons had a single shared feature. They all kept a word for staying, even in cultures where nobody stayed anywhere for long. She had written it as a linguistic curiosity. Reading it back now, alone, with a transfer form sitting unanswered on the shared desk 2 decks away, it read like something else entirely. She understood, finally, what 11 months of silent, unrewarded attention actually costs a person to sustain. It costs exactly as much as it would cost her to say yes. She filed her own transfer request the next morning, requesting his posting instead of the one Command had already assigned her. Command flagged the mutual request for review, the kind of paperwork anomaly nobody at Halyard 9 had generated before, and approved it 4 days later without asking why. Nobody who read the request needed to ask why. The pattern was in the file, and by then, everyone in retrieval infrastructure had learned to read patterns as data, not decoration. Rafe was in the annex when the approval came through. Myril didn't tell him. She filed one more report instead, short, unclassified, addressed to no one in the metadata field, and left the annex terminal open on his side of the shared desk before she left for the day. The way you leave a door open when you want someone to walk through it without being told to. The file was 3 lines long. It said she'd finally figured out what he did with the things he kept. She said she intended to do the same, starting now on purpose without being asked. He read it 40 minutes later. The access log would show that later, though neither of them ever checked it again. He didn't need the log this time. She told him herself. In the one language format, he'd already proven he was fluent and patient, buried on the second-to-last page, meant for exactly one reader and built to be found. 3 weeks after the transfer came through, on their last shift at Halyard 9 before the consolidated posting began, Rafe found one more file waiting in the shared drive, filed under neither of their names. It was the pigeon taxonomy again, the original page 43 untouched. Beside the paragraph about hoarded words and slightly wrong storage, someone had added a single margin note, time-stamped that morning. It said, "Found the right storage. Staying." He did not ask her if she'd written it. He already knew. He had spent 11 months learning exactly how she buried the things that mattered, and she had spent the last month learning that he would always eventually find them.